Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have some very important news out of the state of Georgia where President Donald Trump has officially endorsed Republican Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones in the Georgia's 2026 governor's race instead of Republican Attorney General Chris Carr that is also running. Now this is a very interesting development here because this Republican primary is going to be very competitive as right now Burt Jones and Chris Carr are the only two major Republicans running for governor at this current point in time. And with Governor Brian Kemp not currently making an endorsement in this race, the endorsement of Burt Jones by President Trump is the most notable endorsement, and what Governor Kemp decides to do is very interesting. Now, it says here that from the article from Fox 5 Atlanta that President Trump has endorsed Burt Jones. President Trump took to social media on Monday where he endorsed Jones, saying that he is highly respected and a very popular lieutenant governor. Burt Jones is running to be the next governor of the great state of Georgia. Burt Jones for governor is my complete and total endorsement. He will never let you down. Jones said, "This endorsement means so much, not just because President Trump is my friend and a true leader, but because it shows our Georgia First movement is gaining momentum. From day one, I've worked to deliver real results, fighting for election integrity, cutting taxes, securing our border, protecting our communities, and defending our Georgia values." So, Jones officially announced his candidacy last month, emphasizing his connection to President Trump and promising to eliminate Georgia's state income tax. Now, on the other side of the Republican primary, as I mentioned, Attorney General Chris Carr, who began his campaign last year, recently filed a federal lawsuit against Jones. Carr argues that Jones' leadership committee provides him with an unfair fundraising advantage and should be prohibited from raising or spending money during the primary, where Jones has already lent himself $10 million to his campaign and reported that his leadership committee has more than $14 million available. Now, on the Democratic side, things are very wide open here, with former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, State Senator Jason Estevez, State Rep Derek Jackson, and former pastor and business owner Olu Brown, and former DeKalb County CEO Michael Thurmond, all currently running. Now, this race is open due to the fact that Brian Kemp is term limited after serving 2 consecutive terms. So, as for 2026, I find this news very, very interesting, as Georgia has been one of the closest states at the presidential level in the last few election cycles, and it has been so at the Senate level, and in 2018, it was at the governor level. 2022, Brian Kemp did win re-election against Stacey Abrams by a pretty considerable margin here when you see that he won by 7.5%. But seeing it's going to be an open governor's race in 2026, I think it's more likely we're going to see a 2018 result where Kemp only won by 1.4% against Stacey Abrams. I think we're tracking to see an election more like this. And as I mentioned, Chris Carr and Burt Jones, this is going to be a very interesting Republican primary to watch. The only poll that's been taken was back in 2023, so there's really not too much to go off of here. But in this poll, Burt Jones had 18%, Chris Carr had 9%, and 73% was considered undecided at this time. As for the electability question, because I have seen this question get brought up a lot online, who would be the more electable general election candidate of Burt Jones or Chris Carr? And I don't think there's really a drastic difference. The one thing I'd say is, at least based on the past elections, the elections that involve Brian Kemp or candidates endorsed by Brian Kemp do seem to do a little bit better in the state of Georgia than the candidates endorsed by Donald Trump. And that happens as well a little bit in the Republican primary as well. Specifically, the most recent election I can think of was 2022, where President Trump endorsed David Perdue in the governor primary to try and take down Brian Kemp. Now, Brian Kemp was very unpopular this time, but Perdue ended up losing to Kemp by a lot, 73.7% to 21.8%. It essentially stopped David Perdue at any chance of having a Republican Senate or governor come back in any way. And we saw Brian Kemp win every single county in the state of Georgia. So President Trump's endorsement, it certainly has a law of pull in the state of Georgia, but when it came to against Brian Kemp, not so much. Now, a Republican running against Brian Kemp that's not Kemp himself could be a different story. I think right now Chris Carr is still a formidable candidate, but Burt Jones starts out the narrow favorite to win the primary now that President Trump has officially made his endorsement. I'm very interested to watch now this race to see what happens with Chris Carr. Does Governor Brian Kemp decide to make an endorsement in this race? Do national Republicans and Republican governors line up behind Burt Jones and endorse his race, or do some of them split and endorse Chris Carr as well? Obviously, the primary still has to go the way that it will, and we have to wait and see how that all goes, but for now, it's very interesting to see Burt Jones getting the endorsement from President Trump, who push comes to shove, if I was asked who is the more electable candidate, I would say Chris Carr is a little bit more electable in the general election than Burt Jones is, but this is a very interesting move by President Trump. On the Democratic side, all the names I mentioned are running in this race, as well as Stacey Abrams and Jeff Duncan, the 2018-2022 nominee. Abrams and Jeff Duncan, the former Republican lieutenant governor of Georgia, have expressed interest in running. No matter which Democrat ends up facing off against Burt Jones or Chris Carr, this is going to be a very competitive race after it has been very competitive in pretty much every single election for the last 10 years now. In the early hypothetical polling, that same 2023 poll showed if Stacey Abrams decided to run, she would likely start out with a lead. This race is listed as toss-up from everybody but Sabato's crystal ball that has it as lean Republican. And again, it makes a lot of sense when you look at it. Georgia in 2018 only went for Brian Kemp by 1.4%, what ended up being a very close election against Stacey Abrams. And just 2 years after, we saw President Trump win the state of Georgia at the presidential level by 5.1% against Hillary Clinton. And then in 2018, that was the first kind of wake-up call. Georgia was getting very close. Then 2020, Joe Biden ended up winning by 0.24% against Donald Trump. Now in 2024, President Trump did win the state of Georgia back, winning it by 2.2%, but that's certainly not an insurmountable margin where you can say Georgia is no longer a swing state or a battleground state. It is still certainly one of the closest states to watch for in the United States and will likely continue to be one of the closest swing states going forward for the next few years. Now, as I've talked about Georgia a few times now, the very key parts to watch for in the state of Georgia, we can look here and go more in depth, are the areas surrounding Atlanta, specifically Fulton County. We have here very big Cobb County, Douglas County, Clayton, DeKalb, and Gwinnett County. Lots of voters all packed into this densely populated area. You also have, I believe, did I mention Fayette County as well? All these people living in this area, all closely packed here. A lot of votes in this area of the state. And it does show you the pocket size of the votes. It also shows you how the state overall trended. You can see pretty much every state in the United States trended red in 2024 for Donald Trump, including the state of Georgia. But you may look very interestingly, pretty much all of Georgia trended red, except for one very key area, and that's the area surrounding Atlanta. Now, inner city Atlanta and Fulton County did actually narrowly shift towards Donald Trump by about 1.5%, as DeKalb County also went more red by 2.6%, Gwinnett 1.7%, and Polk over here, a rural county, by 3 points or so. But in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that large of a shift when you see places like Rockdale moving Democratic by 6.7, Henry by 9.2, Fayette by 3.6, then you see Douglas by 6.3, and Paulding by 4.9. Cobb also narrowly shifted a little bit more Democratic, and we see Cherokee shifting a little more Democratic as well. And I'm bringing this up because 2024 ended up being an excellent night for Republicans, where pretty much everywhere in the country shifted red, as I mentioned. 2026, based on the history of midterm elections, especially midterm elections in a president's second term, we can fully expect 2026 will be a more Democratic-friendly election environment, where Democratic voter turnout percentages usually are going to be much higher, which means if the Republicans would essentially have to replicate this entire map that President Trump got in the red areas to make up for what the Democrats are probably going to be getting in the Atlanta area, where unless the Republicans nominate a super popular candidate, Democrats are going to be very energized to get out and vote in the midterms, and then it will be a very, very close election. So President Trump's 2.2% win in 2024, given the right amount of Democratic turnout, could be an under 1 point victory for the Republicans, or maybe even a 1 to 2 point victory for the Democrats. Another very important thing to mention about Georgia is the Senate race from 2020. John Ossoff's Senate seat against David Perdue, where he won by 1.2%, is also on the ballot in 2026. And this and the governor's race are both going to be getting a lot of voters in Georgia, both Democrats and Republicans, out to vote to determine the future of their state. So it's going to be a very important state to watch for on election night. And Georgia is one of the earlier states in the country to have their polls closed. I believe they close at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the first batch of poll closings of the night. So we may start to get some votes out of Georgia in very early, come election night 2026. Now, as for the governor's race in the state of Georgia, on my 2026 governor's map, I currently have 6 states listed as a battleground or no rating, and Georgia is one of those states. I'm definitely waiting for more candidates to announce they're running or not, and some more polling data to come out. Otherwise, it's essentially just kind of blindly guessing based off the recent electoral trends in the state of Georgia and how everything's been close. Georgia seems to be more blue, or is getting bluer at the Senate level, 50-50 flip at the presidential level and a little bit more red at the governor level. That could all change come 2026. Right now, I currently have it as tilt Republican, where it's a little bit under a 1-point victory, but this is certainly going to be a very competitive state in 2026 that Democrats can certainly win, especially if the election environment ends up going their way, more so, or even exactly so how the polls are predicting right now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're talking about the state of Michigan and some news in its 2026 Senate race, where Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate Joe Tate has officially dropped out of the U.S. Senate race. Now this article that I'm reading by AP News goes over the latest developments here, where the Detroit lawmaker is officially dropping out of the race to represent Michigan in the U.S. Senate. He announced last Friday, leaving 3 Democratic frontrunners to compete in the primary. State Representative Joe Tate, who was the first black speaker of the Michigan House of Representatives, told the Associated Press last Thursday that he is suspending his campaign to move in a different direction of service. He was struggling to compete with the fundraising numbers put up by the other 3 Democratic candidates, U.S. Representative Haley Stevens, State Senator Mallory McMorrow, and Public Health official Abdul El-Sayed. This race is likely to be one of the most watched in 2026 as Republicans seek to defend their majority in the U.S. Senate. The past 3 months have been wonderful, just to touch base with Michiganders, Tate said of his campaign. So this is very interesting because when you talk about some of the most important Senate races in 2026, Michigan is one of 3 that I currently have listed in the toss-up category right now, along with North Carolina and the state of Georgia. Now, Michigan has been one of the closest states in American politics in recent years. At the presidential level in 2024, it helped Donald Trump win back the White House by being one of the 3 Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that helped deliver President Trump the White House. Now, Michigan, in its 15 electoral votes, voted for Trump by 1.4%. And when you look at the actual vote numbers, that ended up equating to Trump winning in the state of Michigan by roughly about 80,000 votes, which 80,000 votes certainly sounds like a lot, but in a state like Michigan that has a few million votes here, I think, are combined about 5.5 million votes between President Trump and Kamala Harris. That's 80,000 is really not that much of a large margin. So a very close race at the presidential level. Still very impressive that President Trump won it after he lost it in 2020 against Joe Biden by 2.8%, and he narrowly won it in 2016 by 0.22%. And don't forget, before President Trump came along back in 2012, Michigan was a likely Democratic state. Barack Obama won it against Mitt Romney, who Mitt Romney's father was from Michigan. He grew up in the state. Obama still won it by 9.5%. Now, that was an improvement from 2008 when Obama won it by 16.5%, but Romney really wasn't able to make it super competitive. Trump in 2016 was able to pretty much shock the political world and win the state. And then 2024, Trump won the state again. At the Senate level, in 2024, Michigan was even closer. The Senate race between Democrat Lisa Slotkin and Republican Mike Rogers ended up being a 0.34% margin of victory. Where in this race, Slotkin only defeated Rogers by roughly around 20,000 votes. So an even smaller margin of victory in the Senate race, what ended up being a very close race here, where Slotkin got 48.6%, Rogers got 48.3%, and technically neither candidate broke 50%, so a plurality margin of victory is what ended up happening in the state of Michigan. Now, at the governor level, it's a little different, where the current governor is Democrat Gretchen Whitmer. She won re-election in 2022 by 10.5%, but that is an open race in 2026. We expect that race will be a lot more competitive, especially with Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan running. It will likely be a much smaller margin of victory in that one. So the Senate race is expected to be very close in 2026, just based on how the recent elections in the state have gone. Now, as the backstory on this race, the incumbent Democratic Senator Gary Peters, who was eligible to run for a 3rd term but chose not to do so, is leaving the race to be open for 2026. And lots of candidates on the Democratic side are jumping at the opportunity to run. The 3 most notable candidates of the 4 in the race right now are Abdul El-Sayed, who is the former Wayne County Health Director from 2023 to 2025 and a candidate for governor in 2018. State Senator Mallory McMorrow from the 8th District, and U.S. Representative Haley Stevens from Michigan's 11th District. And there also is a potentially very interesting wrinkle that could be thrown in here, where Dana Nessel, Michigan's Attorney General, has expressed interest in running in this race, though she has not officially made a decision yet if she'll be entering or not. But if she did enter this race, that can certainly shake things up as well. Two other Democrats are listed as possible candidates, but have not been given any indication if they'll run. And now with Joe Tate withdrawing, we see that the Democratic primary field for now is a three-way race between Abdul El-Sayed, Mallory McMorrow, and Haley Stevens. And this is starting to get really interesting because some of the battle lines are essentially being drawn here. Abdul El-Sayed has already gotten the endorsement of two very well-known progressive Democrats, Bernie Sanders, the U.S. Senator from the state of Vermont, and U.S. Representative Ro Khanna from the state of California, who's also maybe potentially running for president in 2028 because he's kind of going around the country endorsing a lot of younger Democrats and setting up his own 2028 ambitions. Whereas Mallory McMorrow has gotten the endorsement of several state senators and state representatives on the Democratic side. Haley Stevens has gotten the endorsement of the former governor of Michigan, James Blanchard, and U.S. representatives, most notably Hillary Scholten and Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House. So it's interesting that it's setting up to be sort of a Democratic primary where you have the farther left, like the most far left voters probably supporting Abdul El-Sayed. Then the most, I would say, establishment Democratic voters, not necessarily moderate, but the most establishment Democratic supporters of like the last 20 or 30 years or so supporting Haley Stevens. And Mallory McMorrow's campaign is sort of in between Stevens and Abdul El-Sayed, not as establishment as Stevens, but not as far left, depending on the supporters, as Abdul El-Sayed. So it's a very interesting primary to see how this is all going. Now, for money, the leading three candidates all have raised a pretty considerable amount of money, but unfortunately, Joe Tate was not anywhere near the levels the other candidates were at. Abdul El-Sayed raised about $1.8 million. Mallory McMorrow has raised about $2.15 million. Haley Stevens has raised about $2.8 million. Joe Tate was not able to break $200,000. In the early polling that's been done thus far, only 3 polls have been conducted, but they all showed in the polls that included Joe Tate, he was not making a very significant impact on this race. The Global Strategy Group poll from back in May to June only had Joe Tate around 4%, and the most recent poll from the National Republican Senatorial Committee only had Joe Tate getting 1%. Now, there is still a considerable amount of undecided votes in this race, but even if they were all to go to Joe Tate, which would not happen, that's not usually how undecided voters break, Joe Tate would still probably have a pretty tough time at winning this primary, so he suspends his campaign. Now it's a three-way race between Abdul El-Sayed, Mallory McMorrow, and Haley Stevens. And this is going to be very fascinating to watch. This Senate primary is completely wide open right now. Haley Stevens has held a narrow poll over all 3 of the polls that have been conducted, but 2 of them have been under the margin of error, and they could all be very, very close to watch for leading towards the primary day. On the Republican side, U.S. Representative, or former U.S. Representative Mike Rogers, and nominee for Senate in 2024, is running again, and after the announcement from Republican Bill Huizenga, the primary is essentially all but cleared for Mike Rogers. He'll be facing off against one of these Democrats in the general election. Rogers already has the endorsement as well from President Donald Trump and U.S. Senators Tim Scott, John Thune, and John Barrasso, 3 of the top Republicans trying to get more Republicans elected to the U.S. Senate in 2026. Now, as for the hypothetical polling, this race is listed as a toss-up from Cook Politico report, Inside Elections, and Savos Crystal Ball, 3 highly respected political predictions websites, and it shows a little bit of a varying degree of matchups, though all of them are close. For Stevens versus Rogers, it shows a very close matchup where Haley Stevens is leading by around 1 to 2 points. Abdul El-Sayed versus Mike Rogers, Rogers is leading by about 6 points on the first round of voting, and then Mallory McMorrow versus Mike Rogers, Rogers is leading by about 4 points. So it shows Rogers would start out with a very slight edge against El-Sayed and McMorrow, whereas against Haley Stevens starts out with a very narrow edge against Mike Rogers. So this is going to be a very close race and a very fascinating one to watch. Now, as for the 2026 Senate map, Michigan right now, you can really go either way with it, whether you're giving it to the Democrats or the Republicans, and I think it is really very dependent on which candidate wins. My own current predictions right now is it ends up being Mike Rogers versus Haley Stevens, and if that were to happen, it ends up being Michigan in the lean Democratic category, which is in between a 1 and a 5% margin of victory. That's how I currently have Michigan going right now. If Abdul El-Sayed ends up winning, then I have Mike Rogers narrowly winning this race by under 1 point. But for right now, I'm leaving Michigan in the lean Democratic category. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you did, leave a comment below telling me your thoughts and any other video ideas you would like to see me cover. That'll do it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're looking at the state of Ohio, where a new poll that came out showed how Democrat Amy Acton and her chances are against Republican Vivek Ramaswamy in this governor's race. So just to give you some background on this news in this poll, Republican Vivek Ramaswamy and Democrat Amy Acton are predicted to be in a neck-and-neck race to be Ohio's next governor between now and November of 2026. Acton, who is a physician and former director of the Ohio Department of Health under Republican Governor Mike DeWine, is attempting to break a long cycle of Democrats falling short in Ohio's biggest elections, as the state has shifted considerably red since Barack Obama's presidency. Ted Strickland was the last victorious Democrat to be governor of the state from 2007 to 2011. Vivek Ramaswamy, a billionaire entrepreneur who is 20 years younger and has followed in the mold of President Donald Trump on policy and bravado. He is touted wanting Ohio to become the state of excellence, ran for the Republican nomination for 2024, entering the race in February 2023 and dropping out in January of 2024. Now, multiple polls have been released that have gone over Acton and Ramaswamy since they announced their candidacies. The most recent poll, however, came on August 5th from Impact Research, which shows the race is in a dead heat, with Acton trailing by 1 percentage point, 47 to 46%, another 7% remaining undecided. Acton is also consolidating Democratic support and leads by 8% among independents, 48% to 40%, with 11% undecided. Now, in what is shaping up to be an incredibly competitive race, Ramaswamy is well known, but has lackluster popularity among Ohio's voters, the pollster said. Meanwhile, Amy Acton is better liked by voters who know her, keeping the race incredibly close, driven by an 8-point lead with independent voters. Further, Acton has room to grow and take the lead as voters learn more about her. Now, the web-based poll of 800 registered Ohio voters was conducted between April 18th and 24th by the Democracy and Public Policy Network at Bowling Green State University, showed Vivek Ramaswamy with a wide lead over other Republicans, including Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost, who has left the race. Now, Robert Alexander, the professor of political science and founding director of the Democracy and Public Policy Network at BGSU, told Newsweek via phone on Friday the big question in Ohio is whether Acton can defeat Ramaswamy in a head-to-head matchup. One way she can differentiate herself is by leaning into her perception as a, quote, scrappy Youngstown kid and painting her opponent as being more the kind of corporate elites. And it gets more in the article into different parts about this race. Now, this is very interesting, because this governor's race poll in the state of Ohio has been moving, becoming a much more Republican state in recent years. You may remember just recently in 2024 at the presidential level, the state of Ohio voted for Donald Trump by 11.2% versus Kamala Harris, where you saw some very impressive wins by President Trump in areas that used to be blue, like Lake County, which voted for Trump by 14.3%, Lorain, which voted for Trump by 5.7%, Erie, 14.1% for Trump, Wood, 10.2%, and some shrinking Democratic margins in Summit, where Harris won by 7%, Lucas, Harris won by 12.6%. Now, the raw vote numbers had Trump getting 3,180,000 votes, Harris getting 2,533,000. So Trump winning by nearly 700,000 votes in the state of Ohio. That is very significant, because Trump's 11.2% win is up from 2020, where he won the state by 8%, which at the time, Ohio being a likely Republican state, was also a very significant and impressive win for Trump, where he defeated Biden by 8 points. In this one, Trump got 3.1.5 million, Biden got 2,679,000. So in this one, Trump won by about 500,000 votes in the state of Ohio. And then back in 2016, Trump won the state by 8.1% against Hillary Clinton. So even though 2020, the election got a lot better for Democrats, and Democrats did better in pretty much every single swing state in this election from 2016 to 2020, the state of Ohio actually moved more red. And we can look at this. From 2016 to 2020, a lot of states became more blue. Even Biden narrowly made up some margins in the state of Ohio, 0.098. But compared to the rest of the country, Ohio remained pretty much the same. And that's very important and very interesting to talk about for the state of Ohio and how it's going now. And that's important to mention, is back in 2012, this was a pivotal swing state that Barack Obama won against Mitt Romney by 3 points, and it was talked about a lot during that campaign that at that time, Ohio was absolutely critical to Mitt Romney's pathway to victory, where if he did not win the state of Ohio, Romney essentially did not have a path to victory. Now, it ended up not really mattering, as Romney lost Florida and the state of Virginia, so then if he did not win those two states, winning Ohio at that point wouldn't have really mattered, as he did not win those ones. But Ohio has shifted a lot from a blue to a red state in recent years. In 2024, where Trump won it by about 11 points, from Obama in 2012, Ohio has moved about 14.2% from 2012 to 2024 in terms of the margin of victory in that race. From 2016 to 2024, Ohio has moved an additional 3.1%, even though Trump won the state by about 8 points. So it's become a lot more of a red state at the presidential level. At the governor level, in 2022, it was a safe Republican state for Mike DeWine against the Democrat Whaley, where he won by 25 points. Now, where Democrats will pause on this, and for good reason, was in 2018, where Ohio voted for Mike DeWine against the Democrat Cordray by only 3.7%. So this shows, at least in 2018, which was the second midterm, or the second last midterm before 2022, in terms of most recent, Ohio can still have competitive governor elections. Now, what further would help the Democrats' point is the most recent Senate election we saw in 2024, where Democrat Sherrod Brown was the incumbent U.S. Senator. He faced off against the Republican challenger, Bernie Moreno. Now, Moreno did end up defeating Sherrod Brown by 3.6% and defeating the Democratic senator and flipping the Senate seat red. However, it wasn't by a supermassive amount, 3.6% win for the Republican on the same ballot when President Trump won the state by 11.2%. So it shows that if you run the right Democratic candidate in Ohio, at very least at the Senate level, it can be a very competitive race, which it was in 2024. Now, that could play into the question on the Democratic side of things in the Democratic primary, which I may get to in just one moment. But that Senate race was close in 2024. 2022, J.D. Vance defeated Tim Ryan in that Senate race, in that open Senate race. 6.1% was also a relatively competitive race. So for 2026, Ohio certainly starts out in the category of this could be a actually pretty competitive race. As Republican Governor Mike DeWine is term limited, it cannot seek a third consecutive term. If you look just at the presidential level, it suggests that this race should be a likely Republican win. If you look just at the Senate level, you could argue, given the closeness of the last two elections, it should probably start out as lean Republican. At the governor level, it's really interesting, because it could either be lean Republican or safe Republican or likely Republican. If you look at the last two elections, probably, I would say, starting out in the lean category. What we do know for sure is Vivek Ramaswamy is going to be the Republican nominee. Even if Lieutenant Governor Jim Tressel decides to enter this race, the early primary data shows Vivek Ramaswamy with a massive lead over his opponents before they dropped out of the race. Now, he also has the endorsement of President Trump, a few U.S. senators, U.S. representatives, and several notable individuals on the Republican side of things. Vivek Ramaswamy will be the Republican nominee. On the Democratic side, Amy Acton is currently the only declared Democrat in the state of Ohio running for this governor's race. What could make this very interesting is if former U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown decided to enter this race. He, so far in the early hypothetical polling, has showed when his name is mentioned, he is led in these Democratic primary polls from Bowling Green State University and YouGov. Now, when Sherrod Brown does not decide to run and Amy Acton faces off against former U.S. Representative Tim Ryan, Amy Acton wins in that matchup between Acton and Ryan. So Tim Ryan could enter this race, and it could be a very competitive primary if he did, but Amy Acton does start out as the narrow favorite to win that Democratic primary. So Sherrod Brown also recently has been making some news about maybe running for Senate again in the state of Ohio. So I don't think it's super likely that he'll be entering this governor's race. I think it's more likely he'll run for the Senate race. Now, these predictions are interesting because Cook Political Report and Sabo's Crystal Ball both have this race listed as likely Republican. Inside Elections has it as solid Republican. Race to the White House has it as toss-up. And this poll, this GQR poll, which is a Democratic-aligned pollster and is sponsored by Amy Acton, that's one thing the article did not mention, shows a close race between Ramaswamy and Acton. So it is a Democratic poll, so you do have to take that into account and take that with a pretty significant grain of salt. Because, of course, in the Democratic poll, on behalf of one candidate, is going to show that one candidate likely doing very well. But it is still worth significant. Vivek Ramaswamy in the first part of the vote or the poll does still show Vivek leading by 1 point over Acton with 7% undecided. Whereas once the voters were informed of a brief positive message about Acton, she goes up to 49%, Vivek Ramaswamy 45%. Now, in the Bowling Green State University poll from back in April, Vivek Ramaswamy had 50%, Amy Acton at 45%, 5% saying other. Only other polls from another Democratic poll, Public Policy Polling, from back in February, and showed a 1-point lead for Amy Acton with 11% undecided. I think the truth of this race right now is we really just don't know enough about this race to truly get an accurate look of how this race is going to go. Because the 2 out of the 3 polls that have been done thus far were Democratic polls, were the 2 polls that showed this race close. Whereas the Bowling Green State University and YouGov poll, which is not affiliated with the Democrats or Republicans, showed Vivek Ramaswamy leading by 5 points. Now, 5 points for the state of Ohio, I would argue, is still a pretty competitive election. That would be right around the border of a lean and a likely rating for this race, and that is a very close race for Ohio. But again, we really don't have such an accurate look at this race. So I think it's only time will tell if Amy Acton can make this race competitive against Vivek Ramaswamy. Thus far in the Democratic polls, that has been close, but still with a decent amount of undecideds left. So that remains to be seen how this could all go down. When situations like this happen, and there isn't a lot of polling data done thus far, now there are 3 polls, and they all show a relatively competitive race, but I look at the recent election results and the trends in the state. And I already showed you the trends in the state suggest it should be trending towards the Republicans based on the last few elections. Now, the governor's race in 2022, the Democrat was only able to get about 37.38% of the vote. But in 2018, the Democrat Cordray got 46.68%. So I think at very least it's possible we could see Amy Acton probably break around 46.5% to 47% based on the 2018 number. Now, we also saw the Senate level in 2024, Sherrod Brown only get about 46.47%. So if Brown wasn't able to get 46.47%, wasn't able to break higher than that, that could be a worrying sign for Acton. At the same time, though, governor's races can be a lot more volatile than Senate races or presidential races, as usually party voters are more willing to vote for the opposite party for governor than president or Senate. It's kind of a weird thing about American politics that always seems to be a pattern in that state. So I actually would argue that of the elections in Ohio in 2026, I would argue the governor's race is the most Democratic friendly of the Senate and governor's races, even with Sherrod Brown maybe running for Senate, because of how governor's elections are kind of fluky on that regard. But as for the 2026 map in the state of Ohio, I currently have Ohio right now as likely Republican. This is a margin of victory between 5 and 15%. Now, I certainly have it on the lower end of that number, more around 5.5 to 6% at this current point in time. I do think it's very possible this race could get competitive. I certainly don't think it's going to be like a runaway blowout win for Vivek Ramaswamy. I think what some of the polls saying about Ramaswamy's approval numbers not being super high, I do believe there is some truth to that. But I do think the Republicans in the state of Ohio do start out as a favorite to win this race. The only thing that may move that would be how much of a Democratic election environment does 2026 end up being. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you did, leave a comment below telling me your thoughts and any other video topics you would like to see me cover. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in a future video.